going through another topic. And this time we are going over topic 3.3, which is all about belief systems and the changes those are undergoing during the years 1450 to 1750. And we're going to jump right into one of the bigger religious events of the era, which is the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so this mostly is impacting Europe at this point. It will later impact European colonies, of course, right? But for right now, it's just really focused on Europe. Okay, so the context of this, the kind of background, the Roman Catholic Church, which I'm going to shorten to RC after this. So the Roman Catholic Church was losing a lot of power during this time. Politically in Europe. So what had happened is, post-Rome, the Catholic Church had kind of been the only major institution left in Western Europe, and so they had a lot of political power during that time period. However, as we've been talking about, the increase in centralization during this time period by the different nations, right, led to a large decline of the political power of the church, because what we see is that earlier on in the feudal structure, right, the Roman Catholic Church played a very important role in kind of balancing power between nobles and kings and queens, and now that's not necessarily needed anymore because the kings and queens have basically taken a lot of the power for themselves, right? Okay. What we also see is also a growth in corruption within the church. The church, much like any other political state, had a very large bureaucracy, and when you have a large bureaucracy, you're just going to naturally lose a lot of kind of administrative regulation over your people, leading to some corruption, right? With reform efforts at this point being quite unsuccessful. Okay. And so it is into this movement we see kind of a lot of different attempts at change, or at least separation from the church. We're going to talk about kind of three precursors to the main one. We have John Wycliffe and the Lollards in England. Okay. Their big thing was that priests were unnecessary for salvation, right? The idea that you don't have, we've seen this in Hinduism as well, right? But that you don't have to interact with priests to be a good Christian and make it to heaven, right? And then on top of that, they also created a vernacular Bible in English, right? Which was very much looked down upon at this point, as Latin was the language of the church. Okay. We have Jan Hus. Sorry. Let me go back here. Jan? Nope. Let's just do it all over. There you go. Jan Hus and his followers, the Hussites, who were in Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic. They were similar to John Wycliffe, right? They were actually declared heretics by the church. And Jan Hus himself was executed, burned at the stake. And then we have Huldrych Zwingli in Geneva, which is Switzerland. He wanted he wanted to get rid of post-Bible customs, right? Just go back to the exact teachings of the Bible. Right. Especially the celibacy of the clergy, because that was not necessarily a thing that happened. And then we see a massive decline in the power of the church in the era known as the Babylonian captivity. Now, this actually has nothing to do with Babylon itself. It's more of a biblical reference, right? In most of the 14th century, we see the Pope located in France, in Avignon, rather than Rome, right? And so we see massive French influence because of this, French influence over the church increases pretty dramatically here, right? And then that allows them to even, appoint who the next pope is going to be, right? And then on top of this, we see the confiscation of church land and wealth by these growing centralized governments, right, as a way to make more revenue. Okay. And then we even start to see new churches, right? And then on top of this, right, the church also failed to prevent the Black Death, which, you might, with your modernist view, or your presentist view, um, you might look at them and be like, well, that's obviously impossible. But to the believers of the time, right, not necessarily. Okay. Um, and so, in this captivity, by the way, it's basically like I believe there were two popes appointed, and then the pope in France just became the kind of accepted pope by most people. Okay. And so into this steps, I guess the hero of the time, depending on your point of view of all this, Martin Luther. Martin Luther, one of the more important people in human history. He lives in the Holy Roman Empire, right? And he basically comes to the conclusion that several church practices violate the teachings of the Bible. Violate specifically Jesus's teachings, right, according to the Bible, right? And some of those include the sale of indulgences, which the book doesn't even quite signify how kind of bad these indulgences are. They say grant a person absolution from the punishments of sins, but it wasn't even necessarily that. It was more of a there's this kind of thing in Roman Catholic practice called purgatory. This idea where after you die, instead of going straight to heaven, you go to purgatory, and people have to kind of pray for you enough that you get out of there. It kind of proves that you're godly. And so the indulgences just kind of shortened your time in purgatory, right? We also have this practice of simony, right, which is the selling of church offices, right? So he says all of these are bad and not with the teachings of God, right? And these two things combined with I don't know, about 93 others combine to become what is known as the 95 Theses. Oops, sorry. The 95 Theses, which he nails to the door of the church in Wittenberg. And he focuses on the concept of sola fide, right, which is basically faith alone is good enough to get somebody into heaven, right? So the church obviously not too happy about this, right? And so, especially considering that the church and the local ruler of Wittenberg needed these practices to make more money, so they were not particularly happy about that. And so he gets excommunicated pretty obviously, right? But what happens is we see the German princes, right? For those of you who don't recall, the Holy Roman Empire is broken up into several different German territories, and typically are ruled by what are colloquially called the German princes. They might not necessarily be princes per se, right? But it's kind of just a way to kind of categorize them all. And so we see the German princes see this opportunity to distance themselves from the power of the church. Not only the power of the church, but also the Holy Roman Empire itself, because the Holy Roman Empire gets a lot of its justification from the power of the Catholic Church. And if you're not Catholic, then the Holy Roman Empire may not be something you want, right? And so we see this massive split come up here in the middle of Europe, right, between what are called Lutherans, right, named after Martin Luther, and the Catholics. Okay. And so some other things to kind of mention here. is that Martin Luther was not necessarily this radical man, socially speaking, right? But he was radical in the ways that he talked about the role of women, right? He believed that women also had direct access to God, which was not taught Catholicism, which is interesting considering one of the original appeals of Christianity was to women because everybody was spiritually equal, right? He emphasized women's literacy as well. However, Protestants don't have convents, don't have monasteries, so their ability to kind of find a place in society through that was not necessarily there. Okay, so that's our first of the major Protestant religions. Our second one is Calvinism, created by John Calvin. Okay, so John Calvin was a Frenchman living in Switzerland, in Geneva. He creates a religious community in Geneva, almost like an experiment, right? And that community is kind of broken up into two major groups, right? But the main one we want to focus on are the elect. And the elect are what are known as predestined or predetermined. They're predestined by God to go to heaven. Oops. So because they're predestined, right, they would end up kind of ruling that community that they had, right, as like this kind of holier group than the non-predestined, right? And so they live very plainly, right? They talk about how they had very simple churches and the elders kind of governed, right? The followers in France are called Huguenots. The followers of Calvinism are known as Huguenots in France. Okay. And then we also have the Reformed Church in Scotland, led by John Knox. Okay. We also have the Puritans in England, which of course will make their way over to the New World. Right, that's kind of all offshoots of Calvinism, right? A key component of Calvinism is the concept of the Protestant work ethic, right? This kind of idea that you work hard because God has predetermined you to. If you're wealthy in Calvinism, it's because you're predetermined to be wealthy, right? And so, kind of this idea of being wealthy showed that you were one of God's chosen, right? And so that created this idea to work hard, right? And so it becomes a pretty popular religion, Calvinism, but also it's kind of offshoots here that we talked about, right? And so Lutheranism and Calvinism are kind of 2/3 of the Protestant Reformation. The last one is the Anglican Church, which has not nearly the high elevated reasons for starting as we did here. But also one thing about predestination is that it doesn't necessarily make you a better person immediately. What you kind of see happen, again, kind of going back to this Protestant work ethic, is that those who are wealthy and powerful in this society, the reason they are wealthy and powerful is because they were predestined to be wealthy and powerful, right? They were chosen to be wealthy and powerful, right? Okay, it's not like I think a lot of people, at least in my classes, assume that since they're predestined, they can kind of commit crimes and be evil and they'll still go to heaven. But the argument is that, well, if you're committing crimes and doing evil, it's because you weren't predestined, right? You're what's called a hearer. You're not the elect, right? And so lastly, Anglicanism is formed by the King of England, Henry VIII. Pretty simple here. He wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, because she was not providing a male heir. He wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, who was a courtier at his court. Right. The Pope refused for a lot of reasons. The one that they pointed out he didn't want to anger Charles V, who was the king of Spain at that time, and also the Holy Roman Empire. Right, Charles V, very powerful man, and so because of this, right, Henry creates his own religion so that he can divorce his wife. The Anglican Church, of course, is still today the Church of England, right? Um, but yeah, you see kind of it actually starts out very Catholic in nature, but then over time it'll have quite a lot of shifts there, right? So these three religions, Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Anglican Church, are kind of the major fonts of the Protestant Reformation. There will be other sects, of course, but these are the main aspects of the Protestant Reformation, or the main religions to come out of it, right? Okay. In Russia, right, we have some major issues between the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the other kind of major Christian sect, and the Tsar. Okay. And this is during the time period of Peter the Great. We had seen this kind of concept of divine right of the Romanovs, and even before them, I believe, as well, which was granted by the Orthodox Church. Okay, so they had this kind of symbiotic, beneficial relationship here, right? And so the church had long been, the Orthodox Church had long been a unifying force in Russia, right? Culturally speaking, especially in a culture or in a country where it is very diverse, right? The church was able to help kind of bridge those gaps between people, right? And so Peter, in an attempt to kind of assert his power, abolishes the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, known as the Patriarch. Okay, and begins to move the church into the government. Right, makes the church part of the official government of Russia, and he creates the Holy Synod. Okay, and the Holy Synod is kind of a committee, right, of clergymen, a committee of clergy, which is run by a administrator that was basically reporting directly to Peter. So Peter essentially took complete control of the Eastern Orthodox Church, right? He also raised the minimum age for monks to 50. And of course, we see, but this upsets the peasants and a group known as the Old Believers, who, of course, are kind of just like, hey, we want to go back to the way Eastern Orthodox Church was, right? But not enough to necessarily cause any issues on its own. Okay. So those are the major changes religiously going on in Europe at this time, but there are, of course, reactions to these changes. We have the Counter-Reformation, also known as the Catholic Reformation. Okay, so the Catholic Church fights against the Protestant attacks, right? So the Roman Catholic Church fights against the Protestant kind of accusations, especially given out by Martin Luther. And for those of you who don't understand why it's called Protestant, right? These are protest religions, right? They are protesting the state of the Catholic Church, right? They talk about three major changes here. Okay, we have the Inquisition become much more powerful and important. It had already been around for a while, but especially in Spain, right? They're used to root out non-believers, right, and punish them, even to the point of executing them, usually via being burned at the stake. Okay. We have the Jesuits, also known as the Society of Jesus, kind of become the most famous missionaries created by Ignatius of Loyola. They were they would undertake missionary activity, kind of in hopes to get ahead of Protestant, um, Protestant religion, which wasn't necessarily a missionary sect of Christianity, but they especially focused on Japan, India, and then eventually the New World. Right. The last thing here is the Council of Trent. Okay, so the Council of Trent basically like tried to end the corruption. Right, they got rid of the indulgences in simony, or at least attempted to. Right, but they also kind of reaffirmed the ritualistic aspects of Christianity. Especially the rituals that the priest controlled, right? Such as marriage, right? Marriage kind of being a key ritual of Christianity, right? And then they also tried to improve the education of priests, right? Creating more education opportunities for priests, which hopefully would also curb that corruption. But then they also published a book of a list of banned books, the Index of Prohibited Books, which of course included Protestant Bibles and the writings of Nicholas Copernicus, a Polish astronomer, right? Okay, and so basically we see this kind of the Counter-Reformation centered around these three things is pretty successful in the Mediterranean world, right? In Italy and Spain in particular, right? And of course their later colonies, right? Especially these Spanish colonies, right? Um, and so kind of as a side note to all this, right? The emperor we talked about, Charles V. He is the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, but not only that, he's also the emperor of the Spanish Empire, right? Which at that time includes Spain and their colonial territories during the 16th century. But he abdicates his throne, which means he basically resigns due to his inability to halt the Lutherans. Kind of just he gets too frustrated with it. But the key thing that he does here is he splits his empire, giving his son Philip II Spain, and then he gives his brother Ferdinand the Holy Roman Empire. And to Charles is a Habsburg, which they are also kind of the kings of Austria. So Austria within the Holy Roman Empire, right? The most powerful state within the Holy Roman Empire. The most powerful state within the Holy Roman Empire tends to become whoever's in charge of that tends to become the Holy Roman Emperor, right? Philip II will crusade into in Netherlands, right? In Netherlands, which is at this time both Netherlands and Belgium, takes it over, makes it a colony of Spain. And then on top of that, he also takes the Spanish Armada to England, where he loses it in a massive storm. And so basically, he took the Spanish Armada over to try to reconvert England back to Christianity or to Catholicism, since they had switched over to Anglicanism, kind of creating this huge decline in the Spanish power at that point. Okay. All right. So that's one reaction to all this change in religion in England and in Europe. But the probably bigger event of the era is the massive religious wars that occur during this time period, right? So they first talk about the fight between Charles V versus what's called the German Lutheran Schmalkaldic League. We're just going to say Charles V versus the German Protestants, or the German Lutherans. Okay, and that ends with the Peace of Augsburg. And the Peace of Augsburg is very important because it creates the concept of religious freedom uh, within bounds, right? With between Lutheran and Catholic, right? You can be one of those. Each German state gets to choose whether its ruler is Catholic or Lutheran, right? And so you could then kind of move to different territories if you within the Holy Roman Empire if you wish to, practice your religion. If you're a Catholic and your German prince decide to be Protestant, right? You can move to a neighboring territory where they practice Catholicism, right? So that's a small one. In France, we have a series of battles between the Catholics and the Huguenots. The Huguenots, again, being the French Calvinists, right? And then King Henry IV, who was a Huguenot by birth, he converts back to Catholicism, and then will issue the Edict of Nantes. A lot of pieces of paper being written during this time period that are important. The Edict of Nantes says that there is religious freedom between being a Huguenot and a Catholic in France, right? This eventually gets revoked by Louis XIV as an attempt to gain more power for the Catholics in France, right? And so, because of that, we do see this revoking leads to a lot of people migrating out, especially very skilled craftsmen, right? So these are two important wars, but the by far and without a doubt a war you need to remember, but by far the most important war is the 30 Years' War. Now, I know a lot of people tend to get confused about the different wars with years in it in Europe during this time period. So to kind of maybe make it a little easier, it goes backwards in a way. We have the 100 Years' War first, and then we have the 30 Years' War, and then finally we have the 7 Years' War. The 100 Years' War, France and England. 30 Years' War is basically everybody. And the 7 Years' War, again, mostly France and England, but other countries also participate. Okay. And so this mostly focuses originally on the Catholics and the Lutherans, or let's just say the Protestants, Catholics versus Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire, right? These different sects that are happening due to Lutheran, right? These different German princes, creating new religions, right? Kind of leads to this outbreak of war here, right? The religious conflict within the Holy Roman Empire. But it'll eventually expand into a kind of full-on European conflict, right? I believe one of the only countries that doesn't really involve themselves is England, since they're not on the continent, right? And so we see troops that are allowed to loot to get food and wealth and stuff and payment, cause a lot of destruction. But this leads to a huge famine within Europe. A lot of starvation obviously comes with famine. And then when you're malnourished, you also see a lot more disease, right, caused by this. I think something along the lines of 30% of modern Germany dies during this war. And I think 10% of the overall population of Europe dies in this war. It is very long, obviously, but very very taxing on Europe, right? So we see an end to this war with the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia allows religious tolerance of one of three religions, where you can be Catholic, you can be Lutheran, you can be Calvinist. Right? Each territory can choose what it is in each person of those territories, right? And so what we see then is that we see France, Spain, and of course Italy are Catholic, where Northern Europe on the whole is going to be Protestant, one way or the other, whether Calvinist or Lutheran. Right? England was Protestant, but they had a state church. So what we see here, the kind of political impact is that the increase in power for the German princes again, right? This this religious freedom gives them a lot more political freedom as well, right? They can simply basically almost blackmail the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor that they'll switch to the different religion, right? The other thing is that we see Prussia, okay, which is modern day, mostly Germany and parts of Western Poland, and then most of the modern day country of Austria start to assert their power within the Holy Roman Empire, kind of creating alliance systems around themselves, right? And in particular, Prussia becomes well regarded for its military. So a lot of the fighting happened within Prussia and Bohemia, and so to protect themselves, they start to create a massive military tradition. And that military tradition is going to play a very major role going forward in European politics, because as we see Prussia start to kind of coalesce into this very strong state, they're going to use that military to great effect. All right. Now, we just talked about Europe a whole bunch, but let's take a very short detour into Islam. They talk about Islamic religious schisms, but I don't really see too much of a schism here, right? We do have different sects of Islam, right? Shia and Sunni, but we're not necessarily seeing a big change here. So the Ottomans are going to be Sunni Muslims, and they bring the practice of this religion into new areas, and also incorporate Sharia law onto territories that previously did not have it, right? The Safavids are Shia Muslims. And so because of this, right, we see conflict between these two sects, right? Specifically, I guess, religious conflict. But also for territory, right? It's not just those, right? Not too much more to talk about there. All right. But what we do want to talk about quite a bit is Akbar in the Mughal Empire, the Mughal Emperor. And this is maybe what he's most well known for. He is tolerant of all religions. He gave land grants to Christians, to Catholic missionaries, or Catholic churches. He gave money and land to both Hindus and Muslims. He himself being a Muslim, right? He also helped promote the new religion of Sikhism. Right? He helped kind of grow this religion, which was a kind of blend between Hinduism and Sufism, the kind of more mystical type of Islam practiced, right? And so it's a monotheistic faith, right? It is monotheistic, and it also does not. It also allows for other religions or accepts other religions. Right? It doesn't say this is the one religion, despite being monotheistic, right? It eventually becomes incredibly popular, right? Especially within the Indian subcontinent. Okay. He also he tries to ease tensions between Hindus and Muslims, which was and is the probably biggest issue of the Indian subcontinent of South Asia. And of course, today we see those issues between India and Pakistan, right? And so one of the things he does is he gives Hindus positions in governments, whether as zamindars or as bureaucrats. Okay. He exempts Hindus from the poll taxes, or accepts Hindus from the jizya, the taxes that non-believers had to pay if they were not Muslim, right? He also they just kind of threw some facts in here about Akbar. He attempted to prohibit sati, which is when wives of dead husbands will throw themselves on the funeral pyres. He also tries to ban child marriage as well. Both of these unsuccessful, but kind of showing his attempt to bring India closer together via getting rid of these more controversial aspects of especially Hindu society, right? And he also had his divine faith, which I'm not going to talk too much about, but that was an attempt to bring the two together. The last one, and kind of really just thrown in here, scientific revolution. So the scientific revolution has its origins in the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance kind of created this curiosity, right, about the existence of the world and how it exists and why it exists, right? And especially with the religious schisms, right? A lot of people start to maybe depend more on science as a way to create depend on reason rather than faith, right? With these religious schisms happening, causing a lot of destruction throughout Europe, right? It became very popular for people to try to think about something else, right? And it starts with Francis Bacon, who is an English scientist and philosopher, and he comes up with the early idea of empiricism. Now, what empiricism is evidence, right? Basically, using evidence to back up a claim, right? Which is an early idea of the scientific method. Okay. And so we see, even during the 30 Years' War going on, you see kind of scholars throughout the continent communicate and interact and start to develop more significant ideas. And in particular, this kind of comes to a head between three guys. We have Galileo with his planetary motions, right? The idea that the planetary motions are elliptical, which he will be excommunicated for. Johannes Kepler, who creates the laws of planetary motion. He talked about laws of terrestrial motion, I guess. Planetary motion Kepler comes up with the mathematic concepts behind why the planets are in elliptical orbits and stuff like that. Let's call that terrestrial motions. But these all come to a head in the teachings and writings of Sir Isaac Newton, right? Who basically creates. He obviously doesn't create, but he discovers the concept of gravity, right? And in his book Principia, right? And so this all kind of leads up to a massive boom of scientific thought, and will also lead us up to a crucial political change in Europe with the Enlightenment, which we'll talk about here very soon. But that's going to do it for this section. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in